All right, guys, welcome to the video for Standard 2. Standard 2 is all about colonial Georgia, okay? So we're going to be talking about Oglethorpe and the charters and everything that goes into sort of the founding of Georgia. All right, so let's get started here. All right, I know last time I talked for 20 minutes. I'm sorry. I'm not going to promise you that's not going to happen again. All right, here we go. So where we start with this story is Georgia is the last of the original 13 colonies, okay? That's important for us to know. Georgia was started with this document signed by the king called the Charter of 1732, okay? Now remember that a charter is just a law, okay? And it usually grants land. And so it granted the trustees, the people who were in charge of sort of creating Georgia, the land for Georgia. And when those trustees, remember those are those 21 men who were supposed to sort of run the colony, when those men created Georgia, they had three main sort of ideas for the creation of Georgia, or three reasons, I guess I should say. So those three reasons. The first is philanthropy. Remember, that just means charity, okay? The second reason is economics. You know, the king wasn't going to just let us create this colony for no reason. He had to get something from it, and he was going to get raw materials. And we'll talk about what raw materials he wanted from Georgia. And the last one is defense. Remember that Georgia is going to serve as a buffer colony between the Spanish and who are in Florida and down in St. Augustine, and South Carolina, which was a very sort of successful agricultural colony, okay? Now, what we need to know about the trustees is that, remember, they were not supposed to sort of benefit from Georgia. They were only supposed to kind of run it, okay? So the trustees were not supposed to get paid from their time in Georgia and sort of from their work in Georgia. They were not supposed to own land in Georgia, and they were not supposed to sort of hold political office. Now, remember that this were the rules, but they didn't necessarily always uphold the charter the way they were supposed to, specifically Oglethorpe, because what we know is Oglethorpe, the guy who was sort of mainly responsible for the trustees, and the only one of them to come to Georgia, I would write that down, he did run the colony. So he basically did hold political office. He was sort of like the governor of Georgia for the first couple of years of its creation. So that's important to know. I would write that down. Oglethorpe did not necessarily follow the charter word for word all the time, okay? All right, next thing we have, let's go into those three sort of reasons for the founding of Georgia, the first of which is philanthropy. Remember that the story goes that in England, they had this thing called debtor's prison, okay? If you were poor and you had owed people money and you couldn't pay them back, you could be thrown in jail purely because of that debt. Today, we don't do that. If you can't pay your debts, you might, lose a car or a house, or, you might, affect your sort of bottom line. They might start taking your money out of your check or something, but they're not going to throw you in jail, okay? But back then they could. And so Oglethorpe had this good friend named Robert Castell. Robert Castell went to debtor's prison. While he was in sort of close proximity with other men, he catches smallpox and he dies. And this really kind of affected Oglethorpe. He felt really bad about his friend dying in a debtor's prison just because he couldn't pay. And so Oglethorpe decides there's got to be something he can do for this group of people that he calls the worthy poor, okay? And the worthy poor are just people in debtor's prisons. They're not necessarily bad people, but they just can't pay their debts, okay? And so he decides that Georgia could be created as a place for these debtors to go and for them to sort of learn a new way of life. They could be in a prison in debt, and then now they own land and they're a farmer and they're learning new skills. But because of that, the rules in Georgia are going to be a little bit strict on them, and we'll talk about what that is. Because these people are sort of benefiting from coming to Georgia, they're not going to be allowed to do things like own slaves and drink alcohol and things like that, okay? He wanted to help the worthy poor, but what we do need to know is that never actually happened. Oglethorpe never was able to actually get the people out of these prisons and bring them to Georgia. It was sort of a good idea, it just never happened. All right. Next one is economics. And remember that the king wasn't just going to grant us all of this land for a colony if he wasn't going to get something from it. And remember the British practiced this sort of thing called mercantilism. And mercantilism is this idea that these big countries like Britain and France and Spain want to go and take colonies, and when they get those colonies, they get the resources that are there, whether it's cotton or tobacco or rice or whatever it is, and then they are going to take those goods, turn them into finished goods, or just sell them to other places, or sell those finished goods to other places. So in Georgia, what they specifically wanted was what we called the wrist crops, W-R-I-S-T. So they wanted wine, they wanted rice, they wanted indigo, they wanted silk, and they wanted tobacco. Now remember, to create silk, you need something called a mulberry tree, and then you need these silkworms that are right here in order to actually make the silk. Georgia, when it's warm, has a good climate for this, but when it gets really cold here in the winter, and so that was sort of messing with the production of silk. And so none of these crops really sort of became profitable at first, except for rice, okay? So I would definitely want to know that out of all of them, it's the rice that actually made money early on in the colonies. Now, later, remember, cotton becomes like cash crop for Georgia, but at first, rice, okay? And it was actually the slaves who brought that sort of knowledge of how to grow rice here. So that's kind of an interesting sort of thing to know. All right, the next thing is defense. And what we have to know is that Georgia was created to be a buffer between the Spanish and the rest of the colonies, okay? And the only time that this really played out was during this event called the War of Jenkins' Ear, okay? So one of the things, if you were a colonist in Georgia, you had to agree to join a militia. And if the Spanish attacked, if you were a male, you had to go and fight. Well, there was this British captain named, his last name was Jenkins, Robert Jenkins, I think. And basically what happens is Robert Jenkins is a captain in the British Army, and he attacks a Spanish ship, okay? And when he attacks that ship, he gets captured, and the Spanish cut his ear off. And he manages to get away, and he returns to Parliament with his ear in his hand, and goes to Parliament and basically says, you have to retaliate. You have to, you can't let them get away with what they've done to me. And so the British Parliament goes to Oglethorpe, and they tell Oglethorpe that he should invade St. Augustine, which is the big Spanish settlement in Florida. And so Oglethorpe gathers a group of men. Remember, he had the Highland Scots, which was one of the groups of people in Georgia who were good soldiers. He had Native Americans, that were on his side, the Yamacraw. And he goes down to St. Augustine and he tries to attack. And he fails, okay? So that does not work. And after they try to attack St. Augustine and they fail, the Spanish are like, this little new colony, Georgia, we're just going to go and take that over. We're not going to let these people try to attack us again. And so the Spanish actually move into Georgia, and they attack Oglethorpe and his men at one of the barrier islands called St. Simon's, which today is sort of a vacation destination. Well, that battle in St. Simon's is called the Battle of Bloody Marsh, and it was this big battle between Georgia and the Spanish. And Georgia actually manages to hold off the Spanish. We managed to win this battle. And so this sort of sets the tide that Georgia maybe isn't someone that the Spanish want to mess with. And so the Spanish do not try to invade Georgia again. And as a result, it sort of sets the southern boundary of the Georgia colony, and it sort of makes us free to, not worry about the Spanish anymore, okay? So that's going to be a big deal as well. All right, let's go to the next one. The next thing I have is the Charter of 1732. Remember that this is the document that creates Georgia, okay? This is the thing that the king actually signed. They said, okay, you have a colony. Well, because Georgia was set up for those sort of philanthropic reasons, the colonists there had a lot stricter rules than the other colonies, okay? And so because these people were debtors, they were worried that, they would get them out of prison, and if they let them come over here and just have free reign, they might, get in debt again or not be, doing the hard work that they were brought here to do. And so the people in Georgia were not allowed to own slaves, which put them at a disadvantage compared to other colonies, because slavery gives you a labor source for agriculture, and without it, it was very hard for the Georgia farmers to compete with, say, South Carolina or Virginia or North Carolina or somewhere like that. They were not allowed to buy alcohol. Alcohol salesmen were banned in Georgia. And the big drink that the people back then wanted was rum, but they could not have it in Georgia. The other sort of restriction that really made a lot of the colonists mad is that they could not sell their land or buy land from other settlers. So like, originally Georgia was set up for those debtors to come here, and so they were basically going to get the land for free. But the people who came to Georgia, a lot of them did pay for their land, and they felt like they should be able to do what they want with it. But because of that sort of the charter and the rules in the charter, they weren't allowed to do that. And the one that really kind of made people mad as well was this last one up here that said that only men could inherit land. So like if you were a man and a woman and you had a child and that child was a girl, that girl could not inherit the land that you had bought. And so that made a lot of the settlers really mad. And remember, it's that anger that these people have that is going to lead to a group forming called the malcontents. And the malcontents are just people who are mad about those rules up there, okay? Also in the charter, there were other groups that were banned. Catholics were not allowed in the Georgia colony. Remember that the Spanish are Catholic. Remember that the French are Catholic. The British are Protestant, which just means they're Christian, but they are not Catholic, okay? Even groups like the Puritans were Protestant. Most of the English people were Anglican, which was, if you remember us talking about Henry VIII and how he split away from the church, okay? So Catholics were not allowed, Jews were not allowed, remember, at first, but then something happens and they let them in. So we're gonna talk about that in just a second. And the last one was lawyers. And this one's a little bit strange. Why were lawyers not allowed? Well, the reason is because at first, there was no court system in Georgia. It was whatever the trustee said was the law. And so they didn't need lawyers, and they thought that allowing them into the colonies might cause problems or debate. And the trustees were basically, completely in control. You could have called them dictators in a way. So that's important to realize, is that these groups were not allowed in Georgia, but that sort of changes pretty rapidly, okay? Next thing I have is part B. It says, analyze the relationship between Oglethorpe, Tomochichi, and Mary Musgrove. Okay, so what happens is Oglethorpe and his men come to Georgia in 1733, and they come aboard this ship called the Anne. Okay, and when they land in Georgia, they land down on the coast around what is present-day Savannah. And the land where they arrive is called Yamacraw Bluff, okay? And the Yamacraw were a group of Native Americans who had split apart from the Creek and the Cherokee, and they had sort of formed their own tribe, and it was led by a guy named Chief Tomochichi. And Tomochichi wanted to side with he wanted to side with the British, right? Well, Tomochichi, as soon as Oglethorpe showed up, actually gave them the land for Yamacraw Bluff, and it becomes present-day Savannah. So it's where Savannah is where Oglethorpe and his men established the very first sort of Georgia colony, okay? And so that is important. And what we need to know about that is that Oglethorpe actually designs the city of Savannah. And Savannah at the time was set up to be on a grid system. So if you look right here, this is sort of colonial Savannah. And basically you can see there is the different grid. And if you go to Savannah today, it still looks like this. So if I start highlighting things, like this is one of the grids right there. The city is still set up like this. Now there's newer parts that are not, but if you go to the original part of Savannah, it still looks like that, okay? Which is pretty cool. Sort of shows that Georgia is one of the oldest, it's the Regional 13, one of the oldest places in the United States. So pretty cool. All right. The next name I have up here is Mary Musgrove. What we need to know about her is, remember that she was part Native American, she had a Creek mother, and she had a British father, right? And so she could speak the language of the natives, and she could also speak English. And so her and her husband, a guy named John Musgrove, set up a trade post in Georgia, and they were trading with the natives, they were trading with the British. Well, over time, her husband dies, and she still is running this trading post. Well, what ends up happening is when Oglethorpe shows up, he hears about Mary Musgrove, and he basically gets her to be his interpreter. So she is the one who sort of communicates between Tomochichi and Oglethorpe, okay? And so that's gonna be pretty important, right? So we need to know that. And Mary Musgrove has a lot of other sort of interesting stories. Remember that she claims a bunch of land in Georgia, and the British try to take it away from her, and causes a big stink with the natives there because they like her. So Mary Musgrove did more than just that. But what we need to know is that she was Oglethorpe's interpreter. All right, for this part, we have to look at the different groups of people who moved to Georgia. And so it says, evaluate the role of diverse groups, the Jews, Salzburgers, Highland Scots, and malcontents in settling Georgia during the Trustee period. Okay, so we've got two groups on this slide. The first one is the Jews. Now remember that Jews were not allowed in Georgia during the Charter of 1732. It says that they were banned. And Oglethorpe, remember we said that he kind of tends to bend the rules of the charter a little bit when he needs to. And so unexpectedly, a group of 42 Jewish settlers show up in Georgia. And what happens is Oglethorpe and his men are going through this sickness that is killing a lot of the original settlers called yellow fever. And his doctor has died. He doesn't have anyone to treat his men. And it just so happens that one of the Jewish settlers who shows up is a doctor named Samuel Nunez. And so Samuel Nunez is able to come up with a couple of the sort of small treatments for the Georgia settlers. And he actually, prevents a lot of the people who catch yellow fever from dying. And so Oglethorpe lets the Jews stay because he needs the help of their doctor, okay? And then the second group I have up here is the Salzburgers. Now, remember that the Salzburgers were German-speaking Protestants from Austria. And they were actually kicked out by the king of Austria at the time, who was Catholic. Now, just to kind of give you a background, remember that Catholics and Protestants are both Christians, but there was this thing called the Protestant Reformation, where Martin Luther put the 95 Thesis, the complaints, on the church wall, and then a couple of Christian groups split away from the Catholic Church. Well, Protestants, that's the group that split away. And Catholics weren't really getting along at this time in history. And so what ends up happening is after he kicks them out, they don't have anywhere to go. And it just so happens that England is a Protestant country, and they were ruled at the time by King George. And King George was a German-speaking Protestant, okay? His sort of ancestry was from Germany. And so he feels bad for the Salzburgers, and he decides, you know what, we have to come up with a place for these guys to go. And he lets them settle in Georgia. And when they settle in Georgia, they start a sort of a settlement at a place called Ebenezer, which is down in South Georgia. Well, the place where they end up, it's a swamp. It's bad water. They're too far inland. They, mosquitoes are really bad, and they're dying off. And so they move and they relocate to another place called New Ebenezer. And the Salzburgers were a hardworking group, and they were really, sort of advanced. They had the first sort of water-powered grist mill in Georgia and things like that. And one thing we need to know about the Salzburgers is that they were the only one of the groups to actually have any success with silk. Silk still wasn't a huge export for the Georgia colony, even though it was intended to be. And also something that we need to know about the Salzburgers is that they are anti-slavery, okay? That is going to be a question somewhere. So you need to know that the Salzburgers were anti-slavery. All right. Another group that came over with Oglethorpe was this group called the Highland Scots. And what we need to know about the Highland Scots is that Oglethorpe brought this group because they had this reputation for being fierce soldiers. And so they are specifically the reason why Oglethorpe was able to defeat the Spanish at Bloody Marsh with their help, okay? So that's going to be important. The Highland Scots settle at a place called Darien, Georgia, which is down here, still there today. And what we need to know about the Highland Scots, besides just the fact that they were soldiers, is that they were anti-slavery. And that will show up on a quiz either on Edmodo or on the in class. So you do need to know that these guys were anti-slavery, which is a big deal because remember, there was a lot of groups in Georgia that wanted slaves, right? And so the last group I have up here is the malcontents. And what we need to know about the malcontents is that these are the people who were mad about all the rules. They were mad that they couldn't own slaves. They were mad that they couldn't own alcohol, that they couldn't let women inherit land. They were mad about everything. And so through their sort of constant complaining to Parliament and their constant sort of fighting with the trustees, they actually managed to get the charter overturned 1 year early. And then Georgia goes from being a trustee colony to being a royal colony. And what that's going to mean is that the king is now in charge of the colony, but the king's over in England. He can't run the colony day to day. And so the king is going to actually put in a royal governor, sort of somebody who can sort of serve in the middle. You know, the royal governor is going to do what the king says, but he's going to be able to make those day-to-day choices, right? Because, you know, he can't do that if it takes 3 months on a ship to tell the people what to do one way, you know. Okay. So Georgia as a royal colony. It says Georgia becomes a royal colony in 1751, and that means that the king is in charge and he gets a royal governor. So I kind of went ahead there a little bit. The rules become relaxed as Georgia is a royal colony. So the people in Georgia actually liked the fact that they were a royal colony. A lot of them did. When this happened to other places, like Massachusetts was not happy that they became a royal colony because they had their own legislatures, and in Virginia they had their own legislatures, but now they were a royal colony and the king was in charge. And you got to remember, 1751, we're getting really close to the Revolutionary War, 1776. So up in the Northeast, the relationship with the king is becoming strained. But in Georgia, we are sort of happy that we are a royal colony because it says the rules become relaxed. Slavery was allowed. Women could own land. Land could be bought and sold, and alcohol was legal. So where we're happy about that, other colonies, not so much, because they felt like their rights were being taken away by the king, and we felt like we were getting rights given to us, you know. It says, under the rule of the royal governor, Georgia actually got its first court system because now the trustees are not going to be there to make all the decisions. So Georgia actually creates a bicameral legislature, and we have an upper house and a lower house. And in the lower house, the people actually got to vote. So if you were a male, a white male, obviously in Georgia in the 1750s, you had to own land and you could vote, okay? Which was a huge plus. You know, under the trustees, it was whatever they said goes. Okay, so these people felt like they were getting more power. And in the upper house, you had people that were appointed, and they would have been appointed by the king and the royal governor, you know, would have decided who was in the upper house. So if we were going to kind of compare this to our government today, we would say that the upper house was kind of like the Senate and the lower house was kind of like the House of Representatives, okay? Also, there were a couple of new rules when the king takes over Georgia. If you were a male, 16 to 60, you were automatically in a militia. So if a battle or a war broke out, you had to go fight. Males had to work and build roads 12 days a year. So that was a new thing. White males who owned land could vote. We talked about that. And we got a court system to settle the dispute. So like if you got mad at someone, you know, you were fighting over a cow or something, or you know, a piece of land, now you could go to the courts and say, hey, this guy stole my cow, or hey, this guy's fence is on my land, and there was somebody there to actually make that decision. Before that, the trustees would just go out and look at it and say, here's what you're going to do. So this is the first time where people felt like, you know, they had a say in the decision of what, you know, was going to happen legally. And the last thing that we got to talk about is sort of the economic side of Georgia. Why did the king let us come here? So during this time, we said that Georgia had this thing called the wrist crops: wine, rice, indigo, silk, tobacco. We know that only rice and indigo were really profitable. Rice was the sort of bigger one of the two. We do know that other things were being traded in Georgia though. So it started off with just the wrist crops, but then later it turned into timber, which is just cutting down trees. Tobacco is a really big crop during this time, and fur, you know, killing animals and selling the pelts. It says that if you were in Georgia, you could be a blacksmith, silversmith, tailors, things like that. And there were some small farms or big plantations too, because slavery is going to be made legal. Who did you sell these things to? Well, you could trade with the American Indians for furs. You could trade with the other colonies like South Carolina, or you could even trade with the British or other European countries. The crazy thing about this time though is, like, even if you were trading with France, you would have had to have sent your goods to Britain first, and they would get like a tax on it basically, and then you would have to, then you could trade it to, you know, France or Germany or Spain, whoever, okay? But the British, remember, because of mercantilism, they had to benefit from all materials coming out of the colonies, okay? Let's see if there's anything else that we got to do. And that's the end. So make sure you've followed through to the end. Take the quiz on Edmodo. The notes will be posted there for you. Thanks for making it to the end.